Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I am privileged to serve as president of Duquesne University here in Pittsburgh. It's also my privilege to serve as moderator of this program this afternoon. In terms of my own background, besides my current role, I'm an author of several nonfiction books about difficult moments in American history, Watergate, the Clinton scandals. So in my own work, I've had to use storytelling to tackle some very difficult subjects, and I know firsthand how hard it is to reflect the voices of those involved in the stories, and that's particularly difficult when we're talking about wading into the highly charged waters of hate and violence. But fortunately, we have a very talented and experienced group of panelists this afternoon to talk about how important it is to tell the personal stories of individuals who have been impacted by horrible acts of hatred, and to do it in a way that is responsible, effective, and sensitive. And so to begin our discussion, I'd like to lead off with Patrice O'Neill. She's CEO of the strategic media nonprofit The Working Group, executive producer of the highly acclaimed Not in Our Town television series, which uses film and social media and grassroots organizing to connect people in the fight against hate and bigotry. Her latest documentary film, and many of you have probably seen it, Repairing the World's Stories from the Tree of Life, profiles the actions of residents here in Pittsburgh and our community who overcame fear with courage in the aftermath of the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. So, Patrice, in your work in producing Not in Our Town, it focuses on community responses to hate. So what does that look like exactly, and what have you learned from your approach to examining hate?
Thanks so much for asking. I've been producing films about community response to hate for many years. There are a lot of experts here. It's so amazing to be at this incredibly powerful conference and see the experts who are analyzing what the threats are, who the perpetrators might be. Our focus, our stories, my role as a journalist is to tell a different story. It is a story about community action, about the people who are trying to counter hate, who are trying to build inclusion in their communities. And of course, people who are harmed by hate end up being the most tremendous advocates and leaders in that. And their voices, they choose to speak with us because they want their voices and their stories to be to amplify the work of community response to hate. So it's a different way of looking at it. So, you know, a lot of times when people talk about a hate crime story, they immediately go to the crime, to the story of the perpetrator, to the incidents that happened, you know, in this crime. And it is for us not so much the part of the story. And you could say, well, that's a formula, that's a dramatic formula for any story, right? Is to have the crime, you know, cover the crime. There is so much drama in the everyday interactions and the work of community trying to grapple with what happened and then take action. And I think you'll see that drama in Repairing the World, Stories from the Tree of Life, our story about Pittsburgh. Very little of the story is about the attack, maybe like 1/12 or something. It is about what happens next. And over 3 years, we look at the connections in community. We try to work, it is our aspiration to use a restorative narrative, to think about how our films and stories can help build better communications. Our stories can help communities both heal and move on to action. So there are things that I have learned in the process of doing this about trying to learn from people who have been so deeply harmed. And I think one of them is to wait, right? And that we are usually not the people, although my colleague and friend was here, just in the days after the attack, we did very few of the interviews with people who were harmed most during that time. We have an interview with Rabbi Myers that is crucial and very moving part of the story. But for the most part, we met, for example, the Mallinger family, who are in this room about 6 months after. And there is a time period when people have to try to heal. And talking to cameras is really hard. At least that you can say that. I won't speak for you, but it has been our experience that it's really hard. And, a lot of people just did not want to talk. And that was like, A-okay, understand. Because it's hard. It's really hard to do that. So, the other day in a session about capturing stories and making sure that we are documenting stories of hate crimes, I shared a story about a man who was attacked 15 minutes before he was an immigrant from Colombia. 15 minutes after he was attacked horribly, another man, an Ecuadorian immigrant, was murdered in Patchogue, New York, in an attack by a group of local high school students. And I think about Hector a lot, and how I convinced him to do the interview and how hard it was for him. And, I listened to him for a long time. And I think listening, as journalists, as people who do this work, most important thing to do is listen and try to understand what is important to people and what is important to people to carry forward in your films and your stories. And I think Hector did want to speak on behalf of Marcelo, and that was important to him. But, just like the challenge, people who are so deeply harmed, like, for them it's also like, how do you humanize me? If all these people are going to see this, how do you humanize me? And I think it's just, I know how hard it is. And I have someone here with me, and we're going to show a clip I met because he had an experience with horrific hate crime that you're just about to hear about. He is now my partner in this work. He is co-director with me of Not in Our Town. We met when his family was so horribly harmed. They agreed to speak with us after the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin was attacked, and now 7 people were killed there, including his dad. And we're going to show a clip from this, and a clip of the conversation with Pardeep and his mom, who we met about 6 months after the attack.
And I think it does show, Patrice, how listening and really understanding the people you're talking to, not interviewing per se, but really talking, listening, allows the story to come out much more powerfully. So do you want to play the clip?
These were people who were walking alive just a week back. They are no more with us. We come together in love and peace and understanding rather than, hatred.
It can happen to anybody, any place, anywhere. Hatred, don't care where it goes. What hurt them also hurt us too. We're Christians, we all are brothers and sisters together. That's why we're here. We came to share their grief too.
You never get used to coming into a scene where your dad took his last breath, murmuring, Vaheguru, Vaheguru, please come save me. My mom used to be really involved.
Do you want to stop it, please, and then we
Gurdwara
can start all over so we can get the video?
That's what makes these panels human.
Yes. Maybe should we move on to someone else?
Let's see, give him one more shot.
These were people who were walking alive.
If they can, it's okay. Maybe I can explain it.
Yeah.
Let's try and go on, and then
Okay,
come
yeah,
back to it.
we'll keep talking and then maybe ask you to cue it up a little bit later. But so, Pardeep, why don't you tell us a little bit up here? Nope. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. No, thank you so much. And so one of the things that we think about or intentionally put out that day was how can we, as a community, how can all of us overwhelm what happened to us to the response? That's what we've been talking about all day. Of some of the violence prevention that we really need to do is how are we putting out responsible media? And what does that responsible media look like towards the next person who is going to be hurting and want to hurt other people? And I think that we had that intention right off the bat of like, we have to make sure that we do not go out. And one of the things that I told, and I tell communities that are harmed, especially minority communities, because oftentimes minority communities have to represent so much of everyone. We don't get the luxury of kind of saying, you know what, I just represent myself. And so I tell them, I say, hey, we can cry, we can gripe with each other. We know there's internal struggles, but you cannot go out there and do something that's going to harm our reputation, because all of us are going through this. And I think I knew we had a communal responsibility right from August 6th, really. August 5th to August 6th, 2012. So we started to put out these messages. And I started to see us trying to overwhelm this response. And so as much as it was this, like, it was strategic. I wanted the next person to know, to say, okay, I never want to commit anything that happens like what happened at the Sikh temple of Wisconsin. That can't go on a manifesto. And no disrespect, every one of these situations, and they're all different. But I wanted to make sure, and I think one of the questions that Patrice asked me is like, Pardeep, why do you use the name of the shooter? And I said, because I think we won, and we're winning. And the response by the entire Sikh community let people know out there that we are actually stronger than you are, and that we're not afraid to die in a temple. That's something that we actually, you know what, that's a sacrifice. For us, that's the most sacred place we can die and live and represent our life. And so my father, I let it be known that he died fighting a gunman with a butter knife. He took 5 shots from close range. So this person, and a lot of times I'll get it from the gun advocates of like, don't you wish your dad had a gun? So I've had that question point blank asked me. And I said, you don't understand us. You don't get it, do you? No. We're like, what happened to him is what we call hukum. And it was his, like, that was his temple. He died in the place he helped build. And now it's all of us, like, our responsibility to fight. He let forward that. And so we've been fighting for the past 10 years, but a lot of the fight has been supplemented by this film that has been done in such a calculated way. And if we are to go forward and create a safer society, we cannot glamorize, we cannot make people out there who are watching this to say, if I want to feel powerful, I'm going to do something like that. We have to shift power. Media has to shift power. We all have to shift power. And so that was the objective. And I think that we would do this work with community. We knew that we do this work with community. We do this work with all of you. And I think this is just a celebration of all of that work, but we got a lot of work to do as we go forward.
And besides working with Patrice, Pardeep is also a trauma-focused clinical therapist with Parents for Peace and author of The Gifts of Our Wounds, a Sikh and a former white supremacist find forgiveness after hate. So you're actually looking at perpetrators too and trying to understand all of this.
Yeah, we look at perpetrators, but we help them off-ramp. So, just kind of working within. And part of it is I knew that, so I started working with a former perpetrator of white supremacy shortly afterwards. And again, people say, well, why did you do that? When I walked back into the temple, the Sikh temple, a week later, I saw kids who were, I mean, they were just in a very bad place. They thought that the world just happened to them, right? These are like first generation immigrant, and they're just like, people don't want us in America. That was their mindset. And this person not only said, we don't want you in America, you don't even belong on the face of this earth. And that's a self-esteem thing. So when I partnered with Arno, it was to say, hey, we're actually not even scared to go further upstream and work with a white supremacist, former white supremacist. And for us in our community, we don't have a lot of heroes. We don't look at the TV and say, hey, I see so-and-so that looks like me. We see the Tom Cruises of the world. We see the Will Smiths of the world, right? This is who we see. So I just said, forget it. If we don't got a lot of heroes being represented, let's just become it. And so part of why I do what we do is to say, don't be scared. Be yourself. Be proud, right? Be courageous and know that you are the future of this country. So I needed to get them out of that. And 10 years later, last August, we were able to celebrate kind of the 10th commemoration. And I saw youth of all different complexions and colors say, listen, we're winning and we can win. And this is how we do win.
Are you still working on it back there, gentlemen? Yes. Okay, let's keep going then to Michelle Shepard, award-winning journalist, author, and filmmaker, has covered terrorism since the attacks of 9/11. During her 2 decades at the Toronto Star, Michelle reported from over 20 countries, and also the U.S. Naval Prison in Guantanamo Bay, has written on that and done a documentary called Guantanamo's Child. And her most recent series is CBC's White Hot Hate, about the rise of the neo-Nazi group, the Base. So this is an important aspect of what we're here to talk about today, Michelle. Based upon your 2 decades of reporting and work in all of these different mediums, and also podcasting, what does the media do well and what doesn't it do well when it comes to reporting on hate crimes?
You know, I think nowadays there's some really thoughtful, long-form journalism being done. Films like yours. Podcasts have become my favorite new medium because you have so much time to tell a story. You know, we don't have a lot of attention. We have a bit of attention deficit these days when it comes to news. But ironically, podcasts are taking off, and you have somebody for 3 to 6 hours telling them a story, which is a real luxury. So I feel the longer time you have, the more space you have, the more funding. Typically, there's some really good journalism being done. What I think is still not being done well, and probably getting worse, is sort of the daily journalism and this competitive, whether it's cable news or even sometimes daily print journalism. And I'll just quickly say one small anecdote that when I started in newspaper reporting, 22-year-olds were thrown into it, not much training. I think we had 1 day on training on the job and then went out. My first story was interviewing a mother whose baby had been dropped in a delivery room and had died. And I remember being so devastated having to go. I thought, what is this career that I've chosen? This is ghoulish. And it was so long ago we didn't have cell phones. So I went to, the payphone to tell my editor she's not home. She's like, well, just stay there till she gets home. And I just felt terrible. By the time I got to this poor woman's door, I burst into tears. I mean, after all she'd been through, she was lovely. I stayed in touch with her for years. She actually ended up telling me her story. But it was a very good, hard lesson insofar as that wasn't my role as the journalist. I didn't know how to deal with a woman who had been through trauma. Sadly, over the years, I interviewed many, many people who were victims of war, of trauma. I remember covering 9/11 from New York and making sure, not that I was desensitized in any way, but making sure that no victim had to look after me if I was crying. So I would do my crying at night when I got back to the hotel. And I guess that's sort of a long way of saying that I don't think even today we teach journalism students that enough. We don't concentrate on how do we have a duty of care when we're dealing with those who we entrust with our stories. And even though I've been at this for so many years, I'm still incredibly grateful every time someone agrees to talk to me. And I'm probably the worst journalist in terms of trying to convince someone to talk to me. I'm like, I'm also Canadian, so it's in our nature. But I'm like, you don't have to. It's fine. Or when I would report abroad, people would say, but why? And I would just be so honest. I'm like, I don't know. I'm trying to explain something that's happened here. People need to care about you, to care about it. But once you put your story out there, it's out there, and it can sometimes take on a life of its own. And I can't promise you anything. And I think people do respect that honesty. But I think that's something that I have now after a couple decades of experience. But I just hope that that's something we can teach perhaps our students more, and then through mentorships more. And of course, it's a business, it's competition. But I think that duty of care goes all the way to the top. That you have to, if a journalist comes back and says, I didn't get that story, somebody else did, but I didn't traumatize that victim, that counts for something.
Yeah, and it's a really important point. One of the things I've learned in having the privilege of working with these folks is to understand how actually, as you said, Michelle, having more time to work on longer projects and the work that you're all doing actually gives you the benefit of trying to get it right a lot more than someone in the trenches who may not be experienced in this. And I want to talk to George. He's a noted film and television producer, George Weiss, who's based in Amsterdam. So thank you for joining us in Pittsburgh here, George. Founder and CEO of Radio La Benevolencia Humanitarian Tools Foundation that creates media projects to show how to resist hate speech and incitement to identity-based violence. Has done all kinds of great work that has earned him international acclaim. But George adds a unique perspective because he uses entertainment education to do storytelling and to empower victims, help them get through trauma. So tell us a little bit about that, George.
Right. So, we started out with a technique of first of all, we started out with a target audience of perpetrators. Actually, what we try to do is inoculate national populations in Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo to resist getting incited to new genocides and new ethnic violence. And we started out, but actually it started with a concept that I developed in Bosnia, which was to make people talk about resolving conflicts when actually they only wanted to make war. And so we had this concept called Hate, A Course in 10 Lessons, not Love, A Course in 10 Lessons. And we wanted to make parties in the ethnic conflict in Bosnia talk to each other by comparing their what happened by discussing Nazi Germany and not by discussing what happened in Bosnia. And with that concept, actually, when that came to fruition, we wanted to create a European version of that. It was in the 1990s still, and at the end of the 1990s, I contacted a group of psychologists in the United States, Irvin Staub and Dr. Laurie Perlman, who were specialists in comparing different genocides and the psychology of perpetrators, how they were created, the connection between context and psychology, actually. And these guys were invited to Rwanda, and I just followed them to Rwanda. And suddenly in Rwanda, we were faced with a society that was coming out of a genocide. And actually, the party of that stopped the genocide was actually the representative of the 10% of the population who had been the targets of the genocide, the Tutsis. And 90% of the population actually are related to the perpetrators in a way that came out during the trial process that followed the genocide. And what you saw was a whole society full of traumatized people, and we were there trying to talk only about, hey, when you are scared, watch out, because somebody might manipulate you. You might be looking for a group for security. You might be wanting a simple solution and look for a scapegoat. And we wanted to, and we put all this And our debate programs were not strong enough, actually, to deal with this traumatization. So we came upon soap operas that had been used in Africa and in Asia and in South America, telenovelas and radionovelas that were used in order to teach people health messaging, and we translated that to mental health messaging. And while we were doing that, we realized that we were actually only talking about perpetrator trauma. We were actually only talking about what makes people vulnerable to commit acts of identity-based violence. And so we created a soap opera in Rwanda that is still running. It's for 18 years, and we continuously evaluated the impact of that soap opera that tries to embed in the audience knowledge about themselves and what they can do, but also knowledge about their own trauma. And that was done in order to be able to somehow unite the population, because both sides share trauma in different ways that created the impetus to do what they were doing. And what's nice about fiction in general is that you can actually deal with sensitive subjects without touching upon, the raw nerves of the people really that are there. So in our soap operas, we had trauma healers that could actually, there would be situations. I mean, basically, we had two villages that, because of an injustice in the past, were at war with each other. Village A attacked Village B. Village B then re-attacked Village A, and these people all became traumatized. And so we could put trauma healers in there who showed them how to deal with their own issues, actually. So in a way, I feel a little bit, like, hey, we are doing like inoculation programming for populations, and we've translated now our messaging into violent video games. We created a massive online battle arena game in the online space in Europe recently, and we looked at how we can talk to the other side through these video games. But that's our main focus, and in some way I'm very glad to be able to talk about the trauma of targets of violence, because we did that work and we would like to continue that work, but it's somehow, because of the continuous attention to perpetrators, it gets drowned out, and so yeah. So
and it's really interesting. As a writer, too, I'm intrigued, George. So when you're talking about entertainment and, for instance, your soap operas, are you using real cases and people to write them? They're just fictionalized, totally.
We're using real cases and translate them into fiction.
Yeah.
And we try to make it so that people actually don't recognize themselves and people don't recognize the other side, so that they can form judgments in some kind of objective way to deal with that kind of stuff. But in the end, I like Pardip's statement about empowering the victims, really, because that should be all of our goal, really. When we report on these instances, and to show actually victims not as victims but as survivors. I mean, we should honor the victims and we should honor the survivors, and we should be able to say some kind of messaging that they won. Like that's like forgiving is the best revenge. Like that kind of statement. If you can put that in fiction.
It's fascinating work, and of course, for all of us who are appalled by so much violent extremism in television and movies, you're strategically coming at it to try to counter that in a very creative way. Let me switch to Dawn Collins. Her son, Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III, was violently murdered in 2017 by a follower of alt-right Facebook group. And our condolences to you and your husband, Richard. They've actively worked to fight hate crime in Maryland and across the nation. I've had the pleasure of having to talk to Dawn a little bit before this program, and as a lawyer and as someone who deals with legislators a lot, I can tell you it is not insignificant at all that she and her husband's work led to the enactment of the Second Lieutenant Richard Collins III law in Maryland, making it an actionable crime when a perpetrator is motivated in whole or in substantial part by a victim's race, religion, or sexual orientation. And hate crimes they're a very difficult thing. We talked about that some last year at this conference, but you've made a real accomplishment there, Dawn, and we're all grateful for that. But so as a mother of a hate crime victim, why don't you share a little bit your perspective about how these stories are told and how is storytelling, in fact, part of the healing process?
Thank you for allowing me to share my story. First of all, it's very important that we know about hate crimes and we speak their names and the victims and the survivors. Oftentimes, it feels as if we do not remember the survivors and what it is. This is not a one and done for us. This is something that we live with daily. My son, I say, and I'm a mother of a proud lieutenant, he was the best of the best. He was what America called us to be. He was a military officer. He was slated to be an intel officer. So he was on cloud 9 the day he commissioned to defend this nation from all enemies, domestic and foreign. So it was quite devastating to think that he was taken out by domestic terrorists. That's what I call them. And I'm different from Pardee. I will not say his name. What I will say is Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III, the best of the best for America, and let people know that he stood for America and loved America. And there's something else that I'm adamant about, and that's that word patriot. Who gets to use that word patriot? And I say, I get to use it. My son would have been third-generation military. His grandfather was NYPD. So you don't get to tell me that I'm not a patriot because I am a woman of color. So that's how I fight back. And also, yes, we did change that law. And at the time that we did it, it was surreal because my husband and I said, this is only the right thing to do. We didn't know that that was very unusual to go up in front of the General Assembly and change the law the first time around. But we knew it was something we had to do.
Well, so I want to think for a minute with all of our panelists and just jump in. We're supposed to come upon an action item at some point. We've been instructed by Laura and Chancellor Nordenberg here. But first, I want to talk about how you see the role of journalists broadly in all of this. You've touched upon that a little bit, but what are some of the principal challenges for journalists and others who cover stories dealing with hate and violence, and how should journalists and all of us think more intentionally about the needs of the people who have been traumatized in covering this particular topic? Because I think I agree with you, and I think all of us agree, Michelle, that's not something, and I plan on bringing this back to Duquesne University, I can tell you, with our journalism and media program, but it is something that's extremely important to think about. So let's just open it up to all of you to offer your thoughts about how journalists in particular and those who write and cover these events should have a special perspective before delving into a story like this, before just covering a random assignment.
I mean, I guess I can start off just a little bit more of what I said about the training. I mean, I could imagine having either of you, if you were willing to come and speak to journalism classes. I think that idea, or even having people come into a newsroom. I mean, that is something I've never heard of before happening. It would be such an incredible session. I think journalists would really welcome that. Again, goes back to this idea of, the competitive nature of journalism, which, again, it's a difficult question because I think, as I said, they are businesses, and that's going to be a hard thing to roll back. But I think maybe we have a role, definitely in journalism, but I think the public has a role too, in the type of media we consume, the type of media we go for, the sensationalism of it. It's an idea of supporting the type of thoughtful journalism that all of us would like to have. But sometimes I think people are clicking on the sensational stuff too. I mean, the numbers are there. So I think as a public in general, we have that. I do sort of shy away from sometimes, creating a guidebook or handbook. I know they are out there, and there are some that are very helpful. DART, for instance, is an organization that helps journalists with some pointers of how to cover issues of violence. But it was so interesting that both of you have such a different perspective in terms of naming a perpetrator. And that's something I know in our newsroom that we've talked about a lot. And I remain conflicted on because I have, done interviews. One of the sessions that we did, one before this, was about amplification versus suppression of information. And because I covered terrorism for a long time, I think over the years in various countries, I interviewed 3 terrorists who were on the UN watch list. So had they ever left Somalia or Yemen or Pakistan, where I interviewed them, they would be arrested. They decided to do an interview, and I didn't turn it down. How we framed that interview when it came out, I hope, was the best way to do it. Most recently for this podcast, I interviewed the leader of the base, who's now in St. Petersburg, Russia. The base in Canada is designated a terrorist group, not in the U.S., but it has been, basically dismantled. Again, I felt it was very important to interview him, to hold him to account, because it was a podcast. As I said, we had lots of time I could put it in context. I could explain why we were running the interview. Had someone interviewed him and put him on cable news, and he got a 30-second clip where he just got to, say his bit and amplify the hate that he's preaching, that would be irresponsible.
Right.
So again, it's just hard. I mean, these conversations need to be had writ large and in newsrooms every day, but I do shy away from the idea of this kind of handbook because I think it's every situation's a little bit different.
Yeah. Let me just clarify. I think that media should not glamorize or say his name. So I'll clarify for that. Like, media should not say the perpetrator's name. If the person, the impacted family or the community can say that person's name because it provides a lesson to the broader community, then there's a significance to it. But you don't, I think so. I needed to say that name because I needed our community, which was, again, this is domestic terrorism. And our community was terrorized. And these kids could not murmur anything. They were scared of the next bald white guy that was even out in the middle of Metro Milwaukee. I had all these people come up to me. I'm scared of tattooed people. I'm scared of all white people. Why do you keep bringing white people? Why do white people keep coming to the Sikh temple of Wisconsin? And I'm like, oh my God, this whole generation, all of these kids that are here are gonna not be the next lawyers, doctors, elected officials, all of these leaders. So let's provide a blueprint for them not to be scared. Okay, this is how we do it. And so that's what we've been doing for the past 10 so years. But I think with that said, for media to think about how do we empower, how do we put power on those communities? And I think for everything that I look at, terrorism and terrorism prevention, hate prevention, all of this will happen at the speed of relationships. And what I'm encouraging the FBI to do, Department of Homeland Security, for all of us to do, is to develop media, develop proactive relationships. What I heard that day, and from the briefings that happened, that was the first time I ever came to the Sikh Temple, Wisconsin. I've never stepped foot in there. It was foreign to me. I didn't know what the friendly wall was. I didn't know where. So people actually lost their life, right? Because the relationships weren't proactively developed. I think that holds true for media too. Please don't let that be the first time you get to know a community.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent point.
Well, I think guidebook, not rule book, is valuable. And I do think there are people who are going to be 22 years old walking into this that need some guidance and should have some guidance and about these issues. And just as law enforcement needs guidance, we're all participants in dealing with incredibly traumatized people. So I would be an advocate for it. I'm also an advocate for not just looking at the situation of the crime and this persistent center of the drama of the crime, the trial, all of that stuff, and look at, what else is happening. And I think Pittsburgh journalists have done a really good job of that. I think that there has been incredible coverage in this town of all of the activities that have gone on, and more reporting. And I think it's a good example, and providing people examples of, here's an interesting story. This is like a different way of looking at it, so that there is, a broader perspective rather than, it's almost like, it's easier, I guess, to just look at it in one way. So I really hope that we can do that, and that is in some way, giving people examples and guidance isn't, I don't think it needs to be rigid, and I understand what you're saying, but I hope we can do some of that.
Yeah, and we may come back to that as we talk about action items. George?
Well, no, I'm not a journalist, but I definitely think that you have to look at the target audience, and so terrorism acts are perpetrated by people who want to be heroes. So definitely, and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand actually said, "I'm not going to give the perpetrator a name," and I really have never understood why. I understand the whole freedom but what do people really want to know? Like, people want to know, also they want to be, actually people are entertained by news. People are entertained by journalism. And so if you name and the reason for naming that person is actually also to have a character that you can relate to as the perpetrator. And that actually does the work of the perpetrator. And so I'm all for empowering victims, and I'm all for empowering victims, but in a way where really the role model of the survivor of how they acted comes out. And but on the issue of naming the perpetrator, I think like we're all of the same opinion that in some way, besides the freedom of information and all of that stuff. But we're actually really doing the wrong thing. I heard now the names of all the perpetrators of the genocide. I heard it repeatedly during the talks in this gathering, and I actually think, wait, something strikes one as hey, why do we all have to remember these guys? It's like I must say that, but in general, I think since it's about storytelling as well, I think you can deal with all of these things beautifully, and beautifully is the wrong word, but in designing stories that show people role models of how to deal with this kind of stuff, of how to empower yourself, and how to not be a perpetrator.
And Dawn, obviously you have tragically been in the position like Pardeep of having to live through this. And what was your experience with how the death of your son was handled by media, journalists, and what impact did that have on you and your family?
Thank you for asking me that. Initially, they kept using the name of that individual, to my dismay. That's why I'm adamant that I will not use it. And I want to piggyback on something what Pardeep said. So it was important for my husband and I. First, we had to step back, and we have to heal before we come out and speak to anyone. We had to know that we were together and okay. I could not have had this talk with you 3 years ago because, first of all, I wouldn't have been able to get through the tears. But now we're empowered to know what we want to do. And our message is that we must come together as a nation, that we can't let them win. And so my husband and I have organizations, what we call the Social Justice Alliance, and that's between the University of Maryland College Park and Bowie State. And this goes to the point of us not knowing the other. Our first seminar that we had at Bowie State University, some of the students from the University of Maryland College Park visited Bowie State. And one of the students from University of Maryland College Park came up to me, and she was very sincere. And she said, "Wow, Mrs. Collins, this is a nice place." So that's the other not knowing the other. And I said, well, what did you expect? This is an institution of higher learning. We teach, we learn. Now, just for context, Bowie State University is an HBCU. historically black university, where this student from Maryland had never, and these schools are less than 10 miles apart, had never come to Bowie State and did not know the other. So that's why it's important that we have these conversations of knowing the other and not building the fear factor. And that's what I would charge journalists to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. And so we are supposed to have an action item for each of our panels, something not necessarily we personally are going to be working on in the next year, but someone could be tasked to do by the steering committee. And so, Patrice, I'm going to start with you with more than 25 years of experience, dealing with community response to hate. What do you think are, a couple of very concrete action items that we could be working on in this regard based upon the conversation today?
I kind of already said it. I think guidance and examples of other ways of looking at reporting. And I do think that sometimes opening the door and thinking about different ways of reporting and obviously, I think giving people space to speak and understanding where they're coming from. I know the DART Center has done some of that and sort of pulling in that information, but going beyond to talk to people who've done hate crime reporting and talking to some of the people who have survived it or whose family members and really gaining that understanding, I think it would be incredibly valuable for journalists to access that.
And so what would these guidelines or guidance look like in your view? And incidentally, I will say, Michelle, I've done some journalism my whole career, and I was kind of chuckling at the notion of, when you said we don't really need guidelines, but my God, every newsroom has a handbook this thick with whether, C in capital is,
it's probably my PTSD
capitalized
from,
or whatever.
Having
so we already have guidelines on
true.
everything.
It's true.
So it doesn't seem to do any harm.
I actually think we're probably saying the same thing, though. I think it's the steadfast rules. It's that.
Yeah.
But I think absolutely, I am promoting guidance in that sense.
And perhaps it's more, a film or something. So much today we educate through some kind of training or a film session that people are exposed to as part of their onboarding or whatever. Yeah. But it seems as if there could be ways to sensitize journalists especially as they begin their career, but periodically, just like we in all of our professions are constantly receiving ongoing training.
I think you're onto something, though. Perhaps it's the idea of written guidelines, because there are already too many that I was opposed to. But that idea of bringing speakers into a newsroom, or on daily news, I hate to say it's easier on long form, but it is easier when you're making a film because you have the time and you have the space, and there is going to be daily journalism, and that's where most of the harm is coming from. So I think that's the place to, the day after. The day of your son's death, what can you instruct the journalists who are going to your house and knocking on that door? How can they do that in a way that's not going to re-traumatize you? And I think because of the nature of it being so competitive, to have, if you, not to put it on victims, but if those who survivors and victims were able to come and speak to journalists, they would get something out of that, that would go a long way. And I think also in terms of journalism, because it moves so fast, there's never really a debrief of what has happened, and I think that's a really important thing to promote at news organizations too. Like, how did we do that story well? How could we have done it better? How could we have cared for people more?
I think it is the responsibility of targeted communities. We do also have to create proactive relationships. It can't all be on the journalists. Right. So we have to do a better job of creating those relationships. And I do think that you're all saying the same thing as well. Yes, definitely the pamphlet, but a lot of this is heart work, right? Yeah. And a lot of this is like knowing the right thing to do in the right time, and just because there's so many nuances that get missed. And I think that when we think about media today, you have incredible responsibility. People are trying to shut you down because you have such an incredible megaphone. Right? When we came out with the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, right, different generation, different time period. different constitution, same constitution, but different time periods. Now we have weapons of mass destruction, and we have media of also that can cause mass destruction, right? And so we have to be incredibly responsible in what we put out, what message we amplify, and that's what I think that, like, as we go forward, it's only going to get more and more. Weapons are going to get, hopefully they get better, and we can, like, get people out of those moments when they're in crisis and not have them have access to weapons of mass destruction, right? They're going online and they're seeing all of this stuff on media. Kids now have, I see my kids now. I have 4 beautiful children, and I'm like, I have a different existence than you had. When I got an assignment, I would go and say, okay, like World War III, I would go to the library and grab the 3 Encyclopedia Britannicas and try to expound on that work, right? You try to be like, okay, I'm trying to like expound and try to be creative. These kids go World War III. How many Google searches on World War II?
Oh gosh.
That's what
World War III is not our action item.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, that's a Freudian slip of being around too much. Okay, sorry. World War II. So they get all this information on World War II, and they have to decipher not only what is credible, but what is healthy, right? So we have to start teaching that in school, how not to Google up World War III.
Yeah, well, and let me just say then, taking together what we're saying, I do see there could be a pathway where, something in the handbook for journalists as they start is you should be exposed to learning about this subject. All of our professions, in the law, in law enforcement, more and more that kind of training and exposure is understood as an important part of having the tools to deal responsibly with topics. And this does seem like a particular area where, young journalists, but journalists as they move through the profession should continue to be exposed to that. And then, how you implement that, whether you bring in speakers, whether you have videos, that seems as if that may be a pathway that it is at least helpful in exposing people. Yeah. Then you have the relationships you talked about, Pardeep. Yeah, George.
Oh, sorry. Oh, Patrice was first, actually. She maybe.
Well, I'll be really brief. I also think that there is a framing story where if something is like, here are people who are trying to actually do something about it, oh, that's not a story, because it's not a crime, it's not violence, it's not, the narrative. It's like, that's a narrative. And there is a lot to say about that. And opening that up and saying, look, journalism is beyond the daily grind of crime and victimization and all of that. There is another story here about our community, about what can be done. There are so many stories here for journalists that will never see the light of day, ever. And I think the public wants to know about the stuff, the research that's going on, the activities that are going on, what people are doing. It's incredibly, I think, exciting and important to open up for news coverage.
Yeah, but it strikes me though that we're talking like you need to get media like Fox and like other organizations to get those kind of trainings and those kind of guidelines, rather than just focusing on our media, where we know that we can maybe improve things and things like that. But I think that we're talking to a polarized country here, and also more and more in Europe. It's no use just doing this with friendly organizations to improve this kind of thing. It's like you really have to invite the so-called other side over into these kind of trainings and discuss some of the issues, the harm that's being done to survivors, and how to avoid that harm. I think there is some common thread you can strike so that they actually pay attention to that. Also, I think that since this was about storytelling, also this kind of panel, I would like to say we set out to set up what was the you said the media of
Mass destruction.
Mass destruction, right? Media of
And
mass.
also mass love too.
No,
but,
no, no.
yeah.
We just need to do a media of mass instruction, and
There you go.
and that's the kind of thing that is also a little bit missing in our entertainment education. For example, is really a very structured way of teaching people how to do stories that create an educational message without actually causing resistance and reactance in the target audience. So I mean, this is another thing. So I would really try to bring in the so-called other side, the media that talk to the other part of the population that does not actually listen to these media. First of all, and second of all, I would develop further institutionalized teaching of how you can use means like entertainment and maybe other means also to bring messages forward that depolarize the population. Yeah.
Okay, I assume, did we ever get the film to work? Well, we have 1 minute and 43 seconds left, but we started late, so we're going to play it. Go ahead.
These were people who were walking alive.
You know what we can do? We
just
can
a week
YouTube
back.
it.
They're no more with us.
YouTube, Waking in
We
Oak
come
Creek.
together
I just
in
want to.
love and peace and understanding.
I think there's one
rather
more
than-
point to be made about media and reporters and those that are reporting. One thing that I've seen, and as you were speaking, I kind of thought about this, that I've seen a lot of media burnout of the most compassionate media personnel who tell the best stories. And sometimes I've seen them, you know, they're when you're telling them something and you're like, you're the right person to do this. I don't need the copy-paste journalist to come and say, slap a story, just it, and just put it out. Like, so we need to figure out a way to have those reporters, have those folks not get so much burnout from seeing all of this and being inundated with it.
Yeah, excellent point. I think, let me just end by saying it's the most fabulous film you could ever possibly see.
It's showing at 4:30. If you want to go, even if you only see a little bit of it, 4:06. I hope you can go see
But I
it.
hope that you will all join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for a really important discussion today. And thank all of you in our audience for being part of it. It truly is extraordinary here today. Have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.
All right, thank you all. We'll see you later.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.